Hello again. When one of the London railway lines was renamed the Suffragette line a little while ago, it was seen as being a celebration of some people that were fighting for democracy and women's rights and so on. Nothing could be further than the truth when it comes to the suffragettes. History has been very kind to them. Over a century after their activities ended, they're almost universally regarded as having been heroic fighters for a noble and just cause, which is why a railway line was named after them, of course. One of the commonest and strangest misconceptions about the suffragettes is that they were struggling for the right of all women in the United Kingdom to be able to vote in parliamentary elections. This was not at all what they wanted. In fact, as they made very clear in all the booklets, newspapers and pamphlets which they published, they wanted the vote to be limited only to middle and upper class women, those who owned property, paid rates, or who had attended university. Gaining the vote for working class women was never their intention. Some socialists at the time, who were working to gain the vote for every adult in the United Kingdom, regardless of gender or social class, remarked that the suffragette slogan should have really have been not votes for women, but rather votes for ladies. At the front of their publications, the Women's Social and Political Union, whose militant members were known as suffragettes, printed a brief outline of their aims. This began with the firm declaration that the Women's Social and Political Union are not asking for a vote for every woman, but simply that sex shall cease to be a disqualification for the franchise. The word not was printed in capital letters. They were not asking for a vote for every woman. This could hardly be plainer. The suffragettes were not interested in extending the franchise to working class women who did not fulfil the property qualifications necessary at that time to be included on the electoral register. They simply wished for those in their own social class to be allowed to vote. The single greatest myth of them all, and this is one which is still held by the great majority of people in this country, is that in Britain at the beginning of the 20th century, men could vote and women could not. This belief is so fixed in the mind of the average person that it has become almost a truism. It might seem a little mad to dispute something like this, which everybody knows to be a fact. Nevertheless, it must be done if we're to understand who the suffragettes really were. The situation around voting in this country at the time that the WSPU was founded in 1903 was very confusing. Following the Reform and Redistribution Acts of 1884 to 1885, the right to vote in parliamentary elections has been granted to some men in the United Kingdom, those who fulfilled certain property and residence qualifications or who had attended university. What this meant in practice was that over a third of men in England and Wales didn't have the right to vote in general elections. In Scotland, the proportion unable to vote was higher. Around 40% of men in that country couldn't vote in general elections. The state of affairs in Ireland was worst of all, with only half of all men being entitled to vote. Although women couldn't vote in general elections, some had been able to vote in local elections since the passing of the 1869 Municipal Franchise Act. The following year, women became eligible to vote for and serve on the new school boards. From 1875, women could be poor law guardians, and when county councils were established in 1888, women were also able to vote in those elections. In 1892, it was ruled that women could be elected to county councils, the word man in the relevant legislation being held to refer also to women. By the turn of the century in 1900, around 1,500 women held elected office in England and Wales, 1,000 as poor law guardians, 300 as members of school boards, and perhaps 200 district councillors. As we can see, the position regarding the franchise was far more complicated than is often thought. Some women were able to vote and hold office, while conversely over a third of men were unable to do so. Actually, the voting system contained even more startling anomalies than those which denied over a third of men, as well as all women, the vote in parliamentary elections. While some men had no vote, others had two. Plural votes were not finally abolished in this country until after the Second World War. Take the MPs for the older universities, for instance. Both Oxford and Cambridge University each returned two MPs, and those who had attended the universities were able to vote there as well as in the constituency in which they lived. This meant that a man might be able to cast two votes and be represented by no fewer than three MPs. Plural voting of this sort lingered on until 1950. It is an extraordinary thing to reflect upon that as late as 5 years after the end of the Second World War, the principle of one man, one vote, or one person, one vote, wasn't really a thing in this country. What the suffragettes wanted was not for all men and women to be given the parliamentary vote, but for women who fulfilled property qualifications and had been educated at university to be allowed to vote, just as men in that category had the right. This wasn't a struggle for democracy as we now understand it, but a struggle of some members of the middle and upper classes to be enfranchised. The suffragettes had no interest at all in working class people, men or women, being given the vote. I thought it might be interesting to talk about this because in this country we have various entrenched myths, things that are so much taken for granted that even questioning them or raising doubts about them is regarded, if not as heresy, then perhaps as being slightly off. The suffragettes are a sacred cow. Any sort of criticism of them is regarded as being uh, in poor taste, I suppose, is the best way of putting this. That's why when Sadiq Khan decided to name a railway line after the suffragettes, he didn't really know what he was doing, but the very word suffragette is in a sense sacred. He was on safe ground. Calling a railway line the suffragette line is sure to receive applause from everybody, simply because most people don't know anything at all about the suffragettes, which is a very odd situation, really. I thought it might be interesting anyway just to talk a little about this matter, about something which is so widely uh, assumed but is completely untrue.